progressive Christians, I would suggest, sort of often have a canon within the canon of the Bible. There are certain books of the Bible that maybe are our go-to ones more than our friends who are the more conservative evangelical side of things. A case could be made that conservative evangelicals tend to take the Torah a bit seriously, especially Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and maybe the Gospel of John and certain letters of Paul. And it could also be said that progressive Christians tend to embrace Matthew, Mark, and Luke, perhaps a bit more than John, maybe Luke especially because it's the most social justice oriented of the Gospels. Certain particular letters that Paul wrote that might be different than the other letters that are being looked at by other folks, and maybe the prophets, Isaiah and Micah and what have you, Jeremiah. Now that's overstated, but a case could be made that you hear more sermons from different sides and more references from those particular sources from one group more than another. Though I think all of the Bible can be embraced by progressive Christians, including the Torah, including the other letters of Paul, including the Gospel of John. A lot of great scholarships coming out lately. Brandon Scott, in his book, The Real Paul, helps show how Paul has been misinterpreted for many years, 1,000 years, and we would do well to really understand Paul's actual theology, and it's not generally, from that perspective, conducive to a more conservative approach. It really lines up much better with an anti-imperial, progressive Christian approach. And John's Gospel, Wes Howard, Brooke, and others have done some great work of showing the anti-imperial perspective of John that's really in sync with the other Gospels. And as long as you don't read certain things overly literally and you understand the poetry of the language and the general message that's being lifted up, progressive Christians don't have to be allergic to John. It can really be embraced as an egalitarian, woman-lifting, justice-embracing perspective. So it's not so much a matter of, well, some progressive Christians tend to say I'm a Jesus follower, not a Paul follower. And they make up this unfair polarization between Paul and Jesus. And what they know of Paul sometimes in some letters is that maybe telling women not to speak in church and maybe somehow not speaking against slavery, condoning it, and maybe being a bit too rigid about certain understandings of the resurrection or atonement. But those same letters lift up Paul as noting two women who he called apostles. Apostles. Okay, that's rather egalitarian. That's cutting edge for that day and time. And his letters really are about inclusion and love and inclusiveness and helping people to let go of judgment. And Paul owned his own judgment and he wrestled with it. We saw someone in Paul wrestling with his own stuff and allowing grace to actually win the day, and how inspiring that is for the rest of us. Another problem that some progressive Christians might have is they dismiss sometimes too much of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. They say, well, the God of the Old Testament is this way, but in the New Testament, which we should be focusing on, God is this way. Well, that's overstated. There are different theologies in all 66 books of the Bible, different theologies within the New Testament, different theologies going on in the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's really unfair and uninformed to say that there are a God of the Hebrew Scriptures and a God of the New Testament. It's really the same God in different competing, rivaling theologies at work throughout it all.